Hi everyone! Today we're doing the Alchemy Duskmourn set review. It's a little new thing I kind of wanted to work on, and since it's only 30 new cards, I figured I would just do a quick set review. It releases this upcoming Wednesday, and I will definitely be playing a lot of Alchemy and just probably making a few deck tech with the new cards. So, some of the key themes is that there are these Bloom Burrow Glimmers, there's lots of enchantments, there's a spoonful of survivors, and a minor amount of manifest dread cards. Alright, so the first card we're looking at is Welcome to the Darkness. Welcome the Darkness. In general, this card isn't very good. Unlike most scalable cards, rather than being underpowered in the early game, this is just downright awful. You would think with a black draw spell, you would lose more life the more cards you draw, but this, interestingly, is straight up the opposite way. And with how much mana you would have to put in to keep your life total high, it's almost more of a last resort card, which is never where you want to be. However, there's one deck idea where its downside can actually be made into an upside. Because of how setting life total works, you technically gain or lose the difference in life. Because of that, cards such as Roland, Sign of War, that care about how much life you lose will actually track that change in life as well, meaning a cheap Welcome the Darkness can actually become a giant source of mana cheating. And with that discount, you can put into more copies of Welcome to Darkness, or to finish someone off with like a spell such as Sum of Totem Hands, which is the closest thing we have to a Fireball in Alchemy right now. Razor Demon is your classic big demon for cheap with big downside. In this case, when you cast Razor Demon, your opponent gets to pick a free card to cast. The spellbook is only 3 cards, which means your opponent will always get the same choice: Demonic Bargain, Ever After, or Demonic Pact. These are some pretty good cards for your opponent, but also very situational cards as well. Demonic Bargain seems to be the default option a lot of the time. Getting a free tutor can usually find you the best card to deal with the demon, although exiling 13 cards is not nothing. The reanimation spell is nice, but because Razor Demon is so cheap, there often might be little to nothing in the graveyard to reanimate, and sometimes they give back a creature or two with very little impact. Demonic Pact is the riskiest of them all. It has the most overall value, but it does lose the game if they can't get rid of it in time. Even if they have answers in their deck, it doesn't mean anything if they can't draw them. If your opponent chooses this option, they either have an answer in hand, or they're confident that they can draw one. Usually, Razor Demon will end up as a 2-for-2 for you, as they usually will have to pay the ward to deal with it, and if they can't, you should be winning. There are a few upsides, such as, Razor Demon being cheap enough that a large number of cheap reanimation spells can target it, avoiding the downside of giving our opponent a free card entirely. However, it's also weak to board wipes and edicts, which your opponent should be able to find with Demonic Bargain if they're playing them. Demonic Bargain might exile all their answers though, and it is very dangerous in multiples, which makes Razor Demon great multiples. There isn't any specific deck it fits into other than a deck reanimating cheap creatures, such as the Azorius Haughty Djinn deck and the Monastery Mentor deck. We've gotten a few new survivors, which of course directly slot into the survival style of deck that the other survival cards would go into. Epi actually cares about cards with the survivor type specifically and further reinforces the theme. She brings back the Dominaria United mechanic of Enlist, which helps tap your other survivors. But Enlist doesn't affect the creature's toughness, so it won't help Alfie survive combat. Improvised Aerialist is just a strictly better version of the cheerleader from the main set. Giving your other creatures flying can help when triggering survival as well, but in general, finding other ways to attack your creatures is just much more consistent, such as Convoke or Vehicles. Weary Zone Guard, a 3-mana 3/3, is one of the more interesting survivors. For one, because it enters tapped, as long as you play it on your first main phase, it will trigger survival automatically if it sticks around, which is an interesting design space. It's like a 4/4 that enters tapped, which might be too slow, considering we already have 4/4s for 3 mana with upside. It does grow every turn, and it has this weird ability to return lands from a graveyard onto the battlefield, untapped as well. This doesn't really fit into what you would normally expect a survivor deck to be doing, which makes me think that this isn't really a survivor card to begin with. It can still be played in that deck, of course, since Fabled Passage was just reprinted and is a good enough card to be played with this. But on its own, that isn't a lot of consistency to be ramping with this card. It almost seems like it would be better in a self-mill deck or a Delirium deck. The body isn't quite good enough on its own to be playable, and you really need to be getting value off of that ramp to make it worth it. Speaking of tapping our creatures, we have Mocklight Processionist. a 2-mana 2/2 that gives all of your enchantment spells convoke. It has a pretty interesting eerie trigger. Whenever enchantment you control enters and whenever you unlock a room fully, conjure a card named Moonlight Processus in your hand. You do discard that card at the beginning of the next end step 12. Now this is a card I'm very excited for. On its own, it's kind of like a mana dork for your enchantment spells, but it also does that with all of your creatures. You know, in a way, it's kind of like a mana dork Triptolith, right, for enchantments that, you know, it's weird. And with something like a Gremlin Tamer out, you can generate a lot of bodies and a lot of mana cheating. It does fill your graveyard quite a bit, since you most likely won't be able to play every single copy you conjure, so it also works with anything that cares about cards in your graveyard. It does feel like I'll be happy to use this, though, is with Dazzling Feeder, a card from the main set that normally wouldn't get a chance to shine otherwise, as it's simply too expensive. One other card from the Alchemy set that I would pair it with is also Solitary Study Endless Corridors. Solitary Study is a 2-mana enchantment rune that gives all of your creatures +1/+0. Endless Corridor is also 2 mana that says whenever you unlock this door, conjure another copy of this card in your hand. When you do, target creature you control gains first strike until end of turn. This is also a very interesting card. The first half is pretty simple, but it's the second half that I find very cool. It reminds me a lot of the card Legion Angel from Zendikar Rising. Much like that, it's a card that you can easily slot into one of your deck, and it just generates extra copies of itself. It's a mana sink, and when combined with things like your creature tokens, it can get out of hand pretty fast. And so sometimes you won't even need the study half. Just being able to pay 2 mana to trigger all of your eerie abilities as many times as you want easily be worth it. And because it conjures copies of itself, it's really easy to put a single copy in your deck. I think any sort of aggro deck that would also like that first effect could easily make room for at least one, which makes this a budget-friendly option too. So here's an example of an alchemy that are just simply goofy. Fear of Change is a 2-mana 2/3 enchantment nightmare. When this creature enters or dies, exile another creature you control. If you do, conjure a duplicate of a random creature card with mana value X onto the battlefield, where X is that exile creature's mana value +2. It's enough change. This really should be called Fear of Momir, because that's pretty much what this card is. There isn't any specific limitation on what creature is conjured, so just like the Momir format in Arena, you could be getting any number of cards. Because of the nature of the randomness, it's really hard to justify giving up one of your creatures to potentially get a worse card. The best use case, in my opinion, is to exile your tokens to get a bunch of 2-drops and hope you hit well. And even if you don't, worst case, your 1/1 turns back into a 1/1, hopefully with some sort of upside or some sort of ETB or a vanilla 2/2. You can also upgrade bad features with good ETBs into hopefully better bodies or hope to buy into a new ETB. It's not good, but it will probably be very tilting at times, just like the Momir format itself. Have you ever wanted an unconditional removal spell in blue? No? Well, too bad. Host mode is 2 blue for a sorcery. Exile target creature. The exiled card perpetually becomes an enchantment, and then you put it onto the battlefield under your control. I have mixed feelings about this card. While in theory, this is just mind control mixed with a little bit of Imprisoned in the Moon, in a way that does feel like just a color break. House mode is literally the same card, but for 1 mana more, you get to keep the creature, and it's a hard to remove enchantment. Yes, we've also gotten cards like Bribery, which give you an opponent's creature, but something about taking it from the battlefield just feels wrong. One thing I also hate about it is how it works in Brawl. House mode is all one ability. If you target an opponent's commander, you will have an opportunity to put it onto the battlefield under your control before they have a chance to put it back into the command zone, letting you steal their commander permanently, or at least until they remove it from your field. It works the same with cards like Necromantic Selection. I definitely foresee a lot of rage quits and rage conceits over this card. Harrowing Swarm has the problem of being a non-creature, or a style of deck that wants a high count of creature spells to flip back up. Of course, on its own, it's a 2/2 for 2, and you should hit a creature some of the time. The best use of it is actually in disguise decks, as you can guarantee that your face-down cards are creatures and will get the discount. Verdant Dread, on the other hand, fits into this weird mid-range card that generates creatures throughout the game. The first copy is just okay, being a single 2-mana 2/2, but If you play more or activate its ability, it begins to scale better and better. Similarly, Unnatural Summons at its base just gives you 2 2/2s across 2 turns for only 3 mana, and it's only 2 mana if you want second. All of these work in any sort of graveyard deck. A 2 mana 2/2 artifact vehicle with haste and crew 1, with a whenever one or more creatures die, it perpetually gives +1/+1, and it also triggers if it's in your yard. You can also sack 2 creatures and pay a mana to return it from your yard to the battlefield, only as a sorcery. Soul Shredder is an interesting payout for playing removal and going wide with creatures or tokens. In a way, it reminds me of Chainsaw as this threat that gets bigger and bigger as the game progresses. It does trade removal for recursion, but it plays pretty similarly, and I'm excited to try them in the same deck. Just don't forget to have enough creature tokens, as you do need 3 creatures on board in order to bring it back and attack on the same turn. Ephraimic Imagined Fiend is 4 mana for a 5/5 legendary creature beast. Oh, you can actually see a little bit of that typesetting, just crunching right up against that set logo. When Ephraimic enters, if you control no other creatures, manifest Dread. Other creatures you control give +1/+1. As long as you control another creature, Ephraimic can't attack or block. This is a card that just could have been printed directly into paper. Ephraimic is a strange combination of abilities, in my opinion. For instance, on a board with creatures, it is simply an overpriced Anthem. However, if you play your Anthem without any creatures out, it gives you a 2/2 out of pity, which is honestly isn't that bad, because Anthems are at their absolute worst on an empty board, where they literally don't affect anything. And finally, it does turn into a 5/5 as a last resort when, or if, your opponent has cleared out everything else you've played. My biggest problem with that last part, though, is that it doesn't really do anything against board wipes, which is where you would want that type of functionality the most. But it isn't a huge issue if you're mainly playing the card for the first 2 effects and the expensive Anthem, but it still isn't great. It's still a creature at all times, which can be both a bad and good thing depending on the rest of your deck and what your opponent is doing. Overall, a pretty weird card. One card I'm having a little bit of trouble evaluating is Glimmer Hoarder. It being a 2 mana 2/2 creature human survivor with survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if this card is tapped, you lose 1 life and you draft a card from its spellbook. That card perpetually becomes an enchantment in addition to its other types. The spellbook for this card are these cards: Angel of Suffering, Aphenia the Cacophony, Belmark Leech, Chitness Crawler, Defiler Flesh, Great Breaker Lamia, Mind Rack Heartbeat, Puppet Razor, and Starving Revenant. Such a weird assortment of cards, but all of them either care about the graveyard or enchantments in some way, but none in a way that's directly connected. Most like the Revenant and Crawler care about filling it, Aphemia and the Puppet Razor actively empty it, the Lamia and the other Harpy and the Angel all fill it, most likely to fuel the former 2 groups. Then you have a Leech that just cares about enchantments, and the Defiler helps you cast permanent spells. It's just such a mid-range value black pile. Glimmer Hoarder on its own, however, is effectively just a 2-drop that draws you a card if it survives combat, and each of these cards that you get to draft is fine enough as a draw that you'd probably be happy picking the best out of a random 3 every time. At the very worst, you probably get some fuel for your graveyard or something to trigger Eerie, since whatever you pick does become an enchantment. All of enchantments, Black continues to follow its enchantment theme with Furor Verticule, a 3 mana 2/3 enchantment creature nightmare. All of your enchantment creatures you control gain menace, and when 1 or more enchantment creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you exile a random creature card from their library. You make a token of that card, but it's a 1/1 enchantment creature. Menace combined with Black's affinity for removal means that you should be able to land a hit or 2 with this out, and it's always great that it triggers off of any enchantment creature that you have out, not just itself. You might not always hit a relevant creature with this, but at least it does exile it from their deck. And, you know, you have like a 6 out of 60 chance that sometimes you hit a great card like Atraxa or Valgavoth. Any deck that cares about enchantments, ETBing, or creatures would probably like this card. Continuing on with more enchantments, we have a new impending enchantment, a Lurker in the Deep. A 6 mana 7/7 enchantment creature, Fish Illusion, with impending 4 for 4 mana. When it enters or taps, you seek an on-land card. Whenever you seek 1 or more cards during your turn, you conjure a duplicate of each of those cards, and then you manifest them. This is kind of halfway between the blue and white Overlord. It generates one body instead of two, but the second body is replaced by a card in your hand. Once it uses the Seek mechanic, you can make sure you always hit gas instead of extra land drops, although that might not always be a good thing. Lurker has its also support for the Seek mechanic, which is something we've actually seen before in an older Alchemy card that rotated out a while ago. Lurker here had an almost identical ability of making bodies whenever you seek. Lurker has an upside of being great in multiples, plus being able to trigger itself with this attack trigger. And if you have something that seeks multiple cards, you also get multiple bodies. And since it's conjuring, then manifesting, and not using tokens, you can fill up your graveyard if those manifests die, or you can bounce your own creatures back to your hand to cast them, or flip them if they are creatures. It's a flexible card, and it should see a decent amount of play alongside all the other Overlords. Mangled Soul Rager is a card I don't really see myself playing. It has a very specific ability that very few decks can utilize very well, and it seems the designers realize this too, as they just added cycling to it. Maybe this effect is stronger than it looks, and sure, it does kill 0-power creatures your opponents control when it lands, but that's a rare case. I don't think switching power and toughness is all that worthwhile of an ability, especially when you have this little control over it. Then we have some generic Alchemy cards with some pretty basic effects. Things with True Abattoir, a single red for whenever you unlock this door, this room deals 2 to target creature, with the other side being Unsavory Kitchen, a 3-mana room that says whenever source you control deals non-combat damage to a player, choose a creature card in your hand, it perpetually gains +2/+0 in haste. To add the Tor and Unsavory Kitchen is like a variant on Shock at worst, but it does reward you for playing a combination of good creatures in classic red removal. Cards that reward good deck building comes down to the numbers, as is the mana value worth whatever number it's giving you? Is a single red mana dealing 2 damage to a creature at sorcerer speed good enough to if you consider the other potential upside that still requires more investment? It's definitely no Bone Crusher Giant, but the second card it comes with just might be worth it enough to make it playable. Replicating Tear is another removal spell with Alchemy mechanics stapled on. 2 mana for an instant speed edict that hits non-tokens should be good enough, especially for seeing more decks that cheat out of Algabah. A feature to your graveyard is interesting as well. You might not be playing cards to reanimate it, but it does help with things that care about the types or size, such as Descend, Delirium, and Collect Evidence. Reanimate decks do care about multiple of those things, so it might be a valid option. Elf Recollections, 1 in a red for sorcery, discarded card. If you do, seek 2 cards that don't share card type with the discarded card. It kind of feels like the red version of some blue Alchemy cards that we've already gotten in the past. Some cool things you could do with this, like if you have too many lands in hand, you can discard 1 and guarantee a non-land to hopefully cast, which is what these blue versions really help with. And while you're not guaranteed to draw a land with Recollections, you can really manipulate what you seek. For example, you could discard an artifact creature like Swarmweaver, and that will exclude all of your creatures and all of your artifacts from what you seek. This gives you a little bit more control over your draws than with a normal discard and draw style effect, but helps you find the missing types you need for Delirium. The Wars of Thunder Junction somehow slipped into this set too, bringing back one of everyone's least favorite Alchemy mechanics. Poltergeist being a 3 mana, 1 black-red for a 3/1 creature spirit with ward, pay 2 life. Whenever Poltergeist attacks, heist target opponent's library. On its own, this is a bit of a removal magnet. Heisting a card on every attack means you'll be getting quite a bit of value if it stays alive, and no one likes having their card stolen. The ward does help a bit on this, but it only costing life isn't going to be much of a deterrent to your opponent. I do kind of like the crossover between mechanics and planes, both because of how Duskmourn connects with the other planes, but also because we don't see mechanics and flavor crossover between sets as often. We mostly see them in paper in sets like core sets occasionally, and mostly in Modern Horizons. We do get to see this a little bit more in the next set of cards here. We have a number of cards here that all work off and fit into the Bloomburrow archetypes, and are also Glimmers, which I absolutely love as a way to incorporate Bloomburrow into Duskmourn. For instance, Enduring Friendship is blue or red for a 2/1 enchantment creature, Otter Glimmer. That's a giant type line with Double Team. And also, whenever you cast an instant or a sorcery spell, creatures you control that are otters and/or enchantments give +1/+1 till end of turn. And then it has the classic Enduring text, where when this card dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It is enchantment. This is a solid card, buffing with creatures. It gives you a second copy if you get in an attack, and even if they kill it, you do get a non-creature copy, just like all of the Enduring cards. It's also super adorable. Notably, only instants and sorceries trigger it, rather than it being the broader prowess-style non-creature spells that the original blue-red archetype supported in Bloom. It's flavorful, and it's a strong build-around with decent support. It's not broken or toxic, and I love how it ties together the flavor between two different sets. This is what I would really like to see more of from Alchemy as a format. We go into the sidekick. White-black for a 2/2 enchantment creature Bat Glimmer, flying lifelink. Whenever you gain life, a random creature card in your hand perpetually gets +X/+X, where X is the amount of life you gain. This is exactly what the bat tech needed. Unfortunately, a lot of the bats have very small bodies, and you can easily get locked up if your opponent happens to have a medium-sized leech creature or two, or anything with flying. Golden Sidekick can buff the various creatures you have in hand, and is great with other lifelink creatures for making them bigger. And also, it does care about the amount of life you gain, meaning it's also very good with the new white leyline. Valiant Emberkin, 1 red, white for a 1/1 enchantment creature Mouse Glimmer. It has haste. Whenever this creature enters or attacks, target creature you control perpetually gets +1/+0. If a creature you control becoming the target of a spell or ability causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. I always felt that Valiant paid for Heroic's crime, and that's why it resulted with it triggering only once per turn. That was honestly probably for the best, especially if it triggers off abilities as well as spells, but Valiant Emberkin here gives me a chance to see what it could have been. And its name is very clear on what deck it's meant to go in. It is very good in the Valiant Mice deck. However, it being a 1/1 usually will lead to bad blocks, as even if it dies, you should be hopefully getting 4 Valiant triggers, which is usually worth it for only 3 mana. It also means they aren't blocking one of your bigger or better threat. And on the sidelines, if you hold it back, you should be getting plenty of value off of your other ways to trigger Valiant. Jilted Ambusher, 1 black, red for a 4/2 enchantment creature Lizard. Whenever this creature attacks you, you may sacrifice another non-land permanent. When you do, each opponent exiles a non-land, non-token permanent they control, and a random non-land card from their library. Then Gilded Ambusher deals damage to them equal to the total mana value of the cards exiled this way. While this does seem good in the Lizard's deck as a way to deal some extra burn damage, I actually think this is best in a dedicated sacrifice deck, where you can make sure to have spare permanents to sacrifice. I could even see a dedicated enchantment sack deck with enablers like Hopeless Nightmare and Disturbing Mirth, Warehouse Tabbies generating extra creatures, and Blood Splatter Analysis as removal that can also get back your creatures in the bench. If built well, you should be able to keep the board clear to get in with some attacks, and it helps with that using its ability. And with how this ability works, you should be getting a minimum of 2 damage off of it, with hopefully an average of 3 to 4, which puts a heavy clock on your opponent. And if you somehow hit a Valgavoth or like an Atraxa, it's going to be incredibly funny, and they're just gonna eat anywhere from like 7 to 10 damage just to the face. And that's really where all of the more direct callbacks to the Kindred archetypes and in the next few cards can fit into their respective decks, but they don't really directly care about it. For instance, Wingbright Thief, 1 white blue for a 2/3 flyer, enchantment creature Burn Glimmer. When this card enters, target opponent reveals each non-land card in their hand. You pick one of them. That card perpetually gains. Whenever you cast the spell, each opponent draws a card and gains 3 life. Wingbright doesn't really fit into the Bloomburrow Birds, which had a strange flyers and non-flyers theme. It did have a few cards that cared about flickering and features, and this is a great target for that. At worst, when you cast it, it gives you a free Revitalize when your opponent plays their spell, and at best, it's disincentivizes your opponent from playing that spell and locks down one of your better cards. And since it does perpetually give it to your opponent's card, it's great at targeting cards that can be cast multiple times, or paired with bounce spells that force them to cast their creatures again. Mischievous Lookout, black and a white, 2/1 enchantment creature Rat Glimmer. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a non-creature, or a permanent spell from your graveyard. If you do, it perpetually becomes a 2/1 rat creature in addition to its other types. Mischievous Lookout is probably the most disconnected from its previous archetypes, with Bloomburrow Rats being the mere threshold, and further back, Wild Drain having Rakdos Sacrifice Rats. While both of those archetypes seem to care about the graveyard, they in general care more about having a large number of rats that contribute to the game plan. However, that means when those rats die, you won't be able to reanimate them with this card. You might be able to fill up your graveyard well, but it would be mostly filled with the wrong permanent types. It definitely fits into more of a artifact or enchantment mid-range deck as a way to generate more value. In a way, this reminds me of how Anacathia, Hand of Erebos, plays in Commander, making creature versions of random stuff in your yard. Shivering Illuminator, a 3-mana 3/3 enchantment creature Swirl Glimmer. As long as the top card of your library is a creature card, you may look at it at any time and you may cast it. Shivering Illuminator is just a decently sized swirl that acts as a form of card advantage. We've seen similar effects at 3 mana, and they've always been just alright. The fact that you can cast this off the top and kind of draw at least one card makes it a little better against removal, as you won't lose out on any cards in hand that way. Our last card is Eager Flame Guide, 2 red 3/3 enchantment creature Raccoon Glimmer. When this card enters, add triple colorless, spend this mana only on creature spell. When this card dies, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until end of your next turn, you may cast creature spells from those exiled cards. This is our last card, and we have a lot of things to talk about this. Similar to Aethermech, the Eager Flame Guide might just be one of the weirder ones that could just be printed in paper. I'm really confused as to what the designers really had in mind when they made this. The only thing I can think of specifically is that it does kind of help you in triggering the expend mechanic, which is what the raccoons in Bluegrove were built around. However, most of those triggered off of expend 4, which is already so close to the Eager Flame Guide's mana value anyways that it doesn't really... It also only adds colorless, which means it will be very hard to spend at exactly 3 or less on creatures, which that mana is limited to. I can't really think of any creature deck that cares about casting multiple creatures on a turn. The second ability is nice, but triggering on death when it makes mana on ETB feels really backwards to me. I think it would make a lot more sense if the abilities were reversed. It would also be nice if it made red mana, but maybe they thought it would be too good if you could chain multiple copies together. It would also want to be a card for other formats beside Alchemy where you can actually make more use of it. Frankly, my biggest problem with this design is mainly the fact that nothing about this card would prevent it from being printed directly into paper. Not even like they could make this work in paper if they just changed these 2 lines, like a lot of Alchemy cards are. This literally doesn't need a single thing changed about this to be printed into, like, foundations or something. Maybe they just had this art and they wanted to use it, but they didn't have any ideas and threw together something they thought they wouldn't be a problem. It could entirely just be that. Alright, well, that was a very long video. Man, okay, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the Alchemy Duskmourn review. Let me know what you guys think. And with that, we've gone over all of the Alchemy Duskmourn cards. There's a lot of decks I would love to try and not nearly enough wild cards to build all of them. But I would also like to hear what brews you came up with. Leave a comment below with any brews you'd like to see, or if you would like me to build around anything that I've kind of talked about today. Also, if you've thought of anything I've left out. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.